Yeah, we don't know who they are, their names, so it's not like
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for October 1st, 2018. Our first order of business is citizen comment on agenda items. And on our sign-up sheet, we have Mr. Guy Namiach signed up to speak if you'd like to go to the podium.
Guy Namiach, Nahmiach, 3650 Ward Road, Wheat Ridge. Good evening, Council. So tonight you're going to be reviewing the alcohol ordinance, or the revised one, or proposed revised one for the parks. And just give you a heads up that we're going to be diving deep into that with the Commission, the Parks and Recs Commission, and making recommendations on, you know, I was looking at this morning, and I hate quoting Avril Lavigne, but why'd you have to go and make things so complicated? That's really, I'm looking at it, and it's just so complicated. You know, the spirit of the ordinance change was supposed to just allow somebody or a family to just walk to the park with a pizza and just sit down on the grass and have a beer. Whether it's a picnic or whether they're throwing a frisbee or it's a concert would be, you'd have a permit anyways. But, you know, instead in there you'll see that we're trying to differentiate between 3.2, 5.0, 6.0, and then we add fermented beverages and malt liquor. Beer is beer, especially today. And last time I heard malt liquor, I was in my dad's Cordoba with the Corinthian leather. So, you know, laws and ordinances are supposed to be easy to understand. We hear that from our citizens all the time. They just want something that's consistent and easy to digest. We want them to walk to the neighborhood park, not drive to a designated alcohol park. And then we just want them to have a beer, just any kind of beer. And then laws and ordinances on the city side are supposed to be easily enforced by officers, not having the need to test the alcohol level in somebody's bottle, and especially if it's homemade beer, right? We're not going to have our officers walking around with little testers. And so just let us come back and with something less fancy and just easier to follow and easier to enforce. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the only speaker that I had signed up. Is there anyone here who would like to speak under citizen comment on any item on the agenda? Okay, there are none, so we will move to agenda item number 1, prohibiting the feeding of wildlife ordinance. And Ms. Manwaring, do we have a report on this?
I do. We'll start us off. The history of this is back in, I believe, 2011. Staff brought to City Council this same ordinance. It's been updated with the intent of really controlling the feeding of wildlife throughout the city, as well as specifically dealing with the geese in Prospect Park and some of our other parks. The effects, and I know there's a lot of backup information in here, but the effects of feeding the geese at Prospect Park have intensified, in part due to the inability to monitor and aerate the lake, Prospect Lake, and it's causing a health hazard in Prospect Park. So we really thought it was time to bring it to council again to discuss, and so that's what we're here tonight to do. There's really two issues. One is accepting an ordinance that limits the feeding of wildlife in parks and open space, and then the second piece is expanding that across the city to private property, except for the animals that you see listed there, which I think are squirrels and birds.
So Ms. Manwaring is correct. We had brought this forward in 2011 at the request of our community service officers, had run it by the Animal Welfare and Control Commission, and had gotten the support of most of the members on that commission. And based on the discussion with City Council, the consensus was to not move it forward. I think Ms. Manwaring speaks to some of the issues that we see in the parks as a result of feeding wildlife. It really does create, hazards in our waterways, certainly impacts the quality of our parks. And having this ordinance would put us in compliance with, the best practices of, the State Division of Wildlife and Parks, and also the Federal Division of Wildlife in terms of the hazards that are posed in feeding wildlife. So we would, ask for some direction from council and certainly questions that you might have. Thank you.
Very good. Questions? Ms. Duran?
Thank you. For our citizens out there, can you give me some examples of the hazards and effects it has on the community?
Margaret Paget, our natural resource manager, is here tonight, and I'm going to ask her to step up and to the podium or to the table and answer that question.
Okay, Margaret Paget, P-A-G-E-T, Forestry and Open Space Supervisor. So there's many ill effects from feeding human food to wildlife, and that causes health problems in the wildlife, causes congregation of animals, which causes disease to be passed more quickly. Predators can come close or gather around where wildlife is being fed as well. And just transmission of diseases happens quicker when animals, again, are congregated. Also, nutrient loading of excrement from the wildlife going into the water, and then we get into water quality issues. Some other questions that might spur my knowledge here.
Mr. Matthews?
I'm just curious, how much of a problem is this? I mean, over the years, like when I was working along a drainage way in Lakewood, the geese were there, thousands of them, and they were just eating grass. I mean, how much of a problem is it with people coming out and actually feeding the geese? Because I think that's probably the majority of the problem we're talking about.
You're correct. That is the majority of the problem. So this is a tool. If we have any excessive bred feeding of geese, and Prospect Park, it has intensified. So I'm not familiar with the area you were speaking about, but we have so many geese in Prospect Park. They're eating the grass. Their excrement is all over the sidewalks. We're in the process of trying to figure out, we use the lake water to irrigate, and the lake is under new water law. So we used to be able to drain it into Clear Creek, but we can't do that anymore. It's the Liambaugh ditch storage. So it has, the water quality in the lake is gotten worse. So this is really a tool for us to use if we have excessive feeding. Now, we haven't had the same issues this year as we had in 2011, which I believe is when the fox got mange and there was a lot of feeding of the fox. So that kind of wiped them out for a while. We think it's a best management practice to have this ordinance in place. But right now, Prospect Park is a problem.
Mr. Pond?
If I could just add to that to give Mr. Matthews an idea of the scope of the problem. With some individuals, they literally will pull up with a vehicle and a trunk full of bread and feed animals, and so you have bread that's left on the grass. It's unsightly, causes an odor, and certainly impacts staff in terms of the cleanup that has to be done there.
Okay, I appreciate it. I walk, the park I'm most familiar with is Anderson, because that's one I walk by a lot. And I just haven't seen a lot of people feeding the geese. But but I have seen them out just in the wild all over. I dive in a lake over by Sam's, and we used to have 500-600 of them that hung out there all winter long. And so diving along the bottom of that lake, you can imagine what I'm seeing after they've been there all winter long. So I mean, I understand the problem. I just didn't realize people were actually actively coming to the parks and doing it.
So you're bringing up a good point as well, and that is that Prospect Lake is filling up, and it's difficult to control that. This isn't going to take care of the entire problem, but it'll certainly give us a tool to use if there's excessive feeding of the geese.
Thank you, Mr. Pond.
I support this. I think it's already been stated, but I'll restate that I think it's just a best management practice. I deal with this at my day job, not inside of the confines of my day job, but around it, and aggression actually is one of the biggest things. I think it can create, and we've seen this, create aggression or closer proximity than is usually prescribed with people and wildlife, and that can cause problems. So I support this. I think it's well thought.
Thank you. Mr. Rand.
I was going to say, I support this also. Would this also include having signage, like at the parks, making it clear that they're not supposed to be feeding the geese?
Yes, we'd cite the ordinance as well.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question on, when I get to section 3, there's a new code section 420, it's enacted. And are these prohibitions A, B, C, D, and E, and F? Or, because I get to section C and it prohibits law enforcement and all of our federal agencies and city employees from engaging in some activities, but I don't see what this is really referring to. And maybe there's more to the original ordinance that's not described here, or is this, section 16-64, protection of wildlife, A, it talks about shooting, capturing, etc. And then it's prohibited, and then B is disturbing nests, etc. is prohibited. And then C is the application to city and state employees. The provisions of this section shall apply to the personnel of any police, fire, or animal control agency. What are the provisions of this section, I guess? Because the section looks like we're prohibiting the disturbance of any of these wildlife, waterfowl.
My recollection, Mayor, and I didn't bring the code section 16 down with me, that there were some parts of section 16 of the code that pertain to the protection of wildlife that were moved over. So if I can get a copy of the code book, I can answer some of your questions here.
Thank you. Mr. Goff has that coming.
So this is part of section 1664, which is protection of wildlife. So it appears that this section here, this new section, which would be taken out of 1664 and moved over to chapter 4, captures that 1664 A, shooting, capturing, etc., prohibited. Is that part of the code as it currently exists today? Section B appears to be the same, and then the current 1664 then goes on to talk about terms. So it talks about wild bird, wild animals. So it appears that Section D, the state protected birds, has been added to this section, as has the part on trapping, been further defined from the current 1664. So most of it is word for word out of the current code.
Section C too, the mayor's asking about section C.
So so Section C appears to be a new part of the code. The current Section C in 1664 just describes birds. So this application to city and state employees, just talks about, as I read it, just merely makes reference to the fact that city and state employees have to, or this code applies to city and state employees when they're acting under the capacity of their official laws. And perhaps our city attorney can weigh in terms of maybe why they felt this section C needed to be added.
So city wouldn't be able to disturb nests or burrows, city employees?
Yeah,
Is that what we're saying? I don't understand section
what
C.
it refers to, yeah. What does it refer to? Yeah.
It's a fair question, and as I'm reading it,
Okay.
typically a section like C is sort of independent. You've got a lot of prohibitions on private activity. You don't want people out trapping leg hole traps, and it's fair for the city to have those kinds of restrictions. And then typically, in terms of the structure of an ordinance, you separately provide, look, when there are wildlife officials, acting within the scope of their duties, they may need to do some of the things that are otherwise prohibited to private citizens. Having said that, I think that if council's inclined to ask that the ordinance move forward, I think the task for myself and for the chief and for Joyce will just to be make sure that we create an appropriate division and distinction between the prohibitions and the regulations on private individuals and the right of wildlife and law enforcement officers to take actions that may otherwise be prohibited, but they're acting within the scope of their duties. They really have a different calling and different responsibility. In the place that is located, it appears out of place. I agree with the chief that we need to look at the existing book, but even then, I think we'll probably be recommending it get moved to a separate section,
Okay.
so that it doesn't conflict. I'm
Or,
happy to do
or
that.
at least provide some wording and clarification on that,
Yeah.
some context for it.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
what we need to do from a structural standpoint.
Okay.
So.
All right, thank you very much. Are there additional comments, Mr. Pond? Oh, then Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I understand the issue with Prospect Park, and to be honest, when I was a little kid, I was responsible for a lot of the bread in that pond. But I'm not quite clear on why we're applying this to the entire city, including private property, and why are we making that modification relative to the application to private property?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
It's just that it appears as though we're making these provisions applicable to both public and private property. And so I'm curious as to why we're including private property in that provision.
Well, do you want to answer that? Okay.
Sure, the feeding of wildlife on private property can be a challenge and an issue for us as well. People feeding foxes, coyotes, birds is generally a pretty accepted practice, but does then create issues with feral cats and those kinds of things. Really what we try to do in these situations when we encounter them is to educate people, and only use enforcement action as sort of a last resort. But there are issues with that, so if you start feeding animals, you get feral cats. Other animals coming in, then you have, as Councilmember Pond spoke to, sort of that interaction between humans and animals can turn aggressive when animals come to expect to have food there, and you tend then to get get, more, issues around vermin, rats and mice and those kinds of things. So it's just a way to try to control that. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I just, as it relates to enforcement actions or calls for service or other sort of outcomes to date as it relates to this type of issue, I understand that it's difficult to apply the rule to no feeding of the geese around the pond since we don't have that specifically in the books yet. But as it relates to past enforcement action, or have we issued any citations relative to any of these?
I didn't ask my folks to pull those statistics to bring in. It's I can tell you it's probably not a frequent from a calls for service perspective, one that's certainly in the top 5 or maybe even the top 10. But when it's an issue, it's generally an issue with residents, surrounding residents and neighbors. And so, to have the tool to be able to educate and, also to be able to enforce if it becomes a neighborhood problem would be helpful.
Additional comments or questions? Mr. Pond?
Yeah, I would ask for a consensus to move this ordinance forward.
Council? All in agreement? We have agreement to move this forward with some editing in the language. I think we have is that a waterfowl?
Don't feed it.
I'm sorry I fed him before we sat down.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. We will move on to item number 2. This is an ordinance amending Chapter 17, Consumption of Fermented Beverages in City Parks. And Ms. Manwaring and Mr. Dahl.
Okay.
Okay, Ms. Wynn.
Thank you. It was brought to our attention by Deputy City Clerk Robin Eaton that the state was changing the definition of their liquor laws. So historically, since there were park rules and regulations, to my knowledge, we've always identified 3.2% beer as allowable in parks, consistent with state law. So this ordinance before you this evening changes the 3.2% to a maximum of 6% malt beverage, and there's some definitions of malt beverage versus malt liquor, but that's the ordinance change that we're proposing tonight to be consistent with that part of the change in the state law. And as many of you are probably aware, again, this is a tool for our police officers and community service officers to use as needed. I don't know that they're out checking every pavilion rental and person in the park drinking a beer to make sure it's 3.2%. I would be surprised if that were the case. So that's the ordinance in front of you tonight and the change that I'm recommending.
If I can add to that, you have a lot of detail from Mr. Eaton and also the Liquor Enforcement Division, and the cover memo, you'll notice, describes for you what may be an enforcement issue kind of generally, which is, same people that make fermented malt beverages, which now can go up to about 6% or so, and eliminating the distinction between 3.2 and 6% beer, which I remember fondly from the late 60s, but we won't go there. Those manufacturers make other things, make malt liquor, which isn't fermented and instead is produced by a different process and therefore can have higher alcohol content, but may look like what we know as regular beer. Having gone through all that detail, though, and thought about it carefully and spoken with Robin at length and Joyce, the cover memo, you'll notice, says, look, permit, you've got a number of choices, but where we came down on in the ordinance was really pretty simple. Taking out the reference to containing not more than 3 2/10% of alcohol by weight, because that's what the state has done anyhow. And what that will mean is, from an general enforcement standpoint, beer is still allowed in the parks. When you think about it, it's not any harder, it wouldn't be any harder going forward than it has been where we've said 3.2 allowed in the parks, the distinction between what 3.2 looks like holding the can and 6% looks like holding the can is 0, as we know. And really it comes down to, and I'm glad the chief is here, it comes down to the fact that this restriction, however we characterize it, is really one that we use, as Joyce says, as a tool, and really on kind of a complaint response basis. We're not out there having to check every can when it goes into the park. So we could get a lot more convoluted on this, but after thinking it through and going down a bunch of rabbit holes, it's come to it's my opinion that the simplest fix here is as shown, which is to delete this 3 2/10% alcohol by weight language, because the state has done that already. There is no such distinction now, and manufacturers can manufacture up to 6 because the fermenting process levels out around there, and you just can't get any more alcohol by the fermenting. The way you get malt liquor is a different process. And I think that's a fair change at this point. It's really the simplest change. On an operative level in the park, if I'm a park user, it's beer in the park still permitted because I'm not able to really to buy something with a distinction. That's fine. I really believe, and I'm curious your questions, but I really believe that to the extent malt liquor, higher content malt liquor and other products show up in the park and people are masquerading those as beer, I think my recommendation is we wait and see if that's even an issue, because I believe if that's going to be happening, what we have on the books hasn't really prevented that. And it really is a matter, as I say, of occasionally responding to complaints, and won't be any harder than it's been to make the distinction. So eliminate the 3.2 and see how that plays. And I also believe the state may come up with regulations that help us make the distinction from an enforcement standpoint, but I don't believe it cries out for more legislating than necessary around this issue. I think every now and again simple is better, and you're a legislature and you always have the right after 6 months worth of looking at something to tweak it. But this is a very minor tweak. It matches up exactly with what the state has done. We'd have to do it anyhow because 3.2 is just no longer a relevant term, so it's eliminated, and that's sort of the smallest, least impactful change, and I think that's where to start. That's my thought.
Thank you, Chief.
So I looked at our statistics for calls for service in our parks last year, and in 2017 we had about 358 actual calls for service into our parks for a variety of reasons. 7 of those involved alcohol-related calls for service. And 2 of those 7 actually involved people who had been drinking that were in cars and ended up being DUI arrest situations. So really when you look at the totality of what we have in our parks, the use of alcohol and people getting out of control is really a pretty minor kind of problem. So I'm in agreement with the recommendation here, just to call beer, and we'll deal with it from there. We're not in support of designating certain parks, as those that you can have beer at and others not. It makes it easier for our officers to enforce when we get calls for service. But Mr. Bell is correct. We don't drive around looking for people drinking beer at parks and checking the alcohol content of beer. That's really going too far. We generally respond to calls for service as it relates to issues and problems that you might have with alcohol consumption. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews.
Just for clarity, should we have a section here? We're saying what we're not allowing. Should there be a section here that says we are allowing beer? Because right now it's kind of mute to that point from what I can see. If we take out that 3.2 part and someone that wants to follow the law and just looks at our codes.
It would be allowed. The sentence as revised would read, the consumption or storage of fermented malt beverages is permitted in any park or recreation area within the city, so long as it's been purchased, legally, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer is yes. We say you can bring it in.
If the average guy understands that means beer, fermented malt liquid.
Again, thinking back to the late 60s, I think the term fermented malt beverage, I'm not pretending to be an expert, but I think that communicates, unless people, we could put parentheses beer, close parentheses, if you like. That would not do any harm. But the nice thing about fermented malt beverages, that is a state-defined term, and rather carefully defined by the legislature, and that's why they've gone through all this heartache that they're going through. And if it came to it that we really needed to enforce and had a reason to prosecute for some reason an egregious malt beverage case coming out of the parks, I would want to make sure that we're prosecuting because it was not fermented malt. It was something else. And if we had put paren beer, that's a defense, I suppose. If I were a defense attorney, I'd say, well, malt liquor's beer too, it says it on it. So.
Okay. Just a question. I'm not adamant on it. I was just
fair enough.
Clarifying.
You're not going to tell us about the late 60s either? Okay. Somebody's got to join me on, no? Okay, all right.
Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I would, to the chief's last comments, that was the question I was going to ask relative to calls for service and how big of an issue it is with respect to drinking in the park. I will, just for the record, note that this is probably one of the only city documents where I've seen Schlitz, Mickey's, King Cobra, and Colt 45, although I was a little disappointed that Old English wasn't included in that list.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
To a certain extent, I am wondering if we're getting a little too, we're going off the deep end on this. For example, if somebody's misbehaving in the park because of liquor, that's already covered. We already have laws against that. So otherwise, what is the offense? The offense is being mature while drinking something more than 6% alcohol?
I think it's important for the city to be clear about what alcohol beverages are allowed in its parks. I really do. And I believe that without being clear, saying fermented malt beverages are allowed in the parks, period, then you're not being clear about wine, about whiskey, and that's a line that I think it's appropriate for the city to draw, that should draw, and it's something I think the public is entitled to hear from the city before you go visit the park. And I think it's something the public's entitled to rely on when they're going to the park, not to drink, but to bring their kids or whatever, and you just know that here's a line that's drawn, and I'm not going to see hard liquor in the park, and if I do, I've got the right to make a call. I think sending a clear signal is important, honestly, and I think it does.
So wine would be legal?
No.
Because it's not fermented, is that the point?
Well, no, look at section 1717. The storage consumption of any malt, vinous, or spirituous liquors is prohibited in any park. No wine, no whiskey in the park. Next sentence, the consumption of fermented malt beverages is okay. That's the line that's being drawn. Here's what you can do. It starts out with here's what you can't have in the park. Here's what you can have. And if I'm going to go to the park or expect to be there, have my kids there, or want to drink there myself, this is a line that I can understand and rely on.
I'd also like to add, we do rent out our pavilions to large groups and our shelters as well. And I have put some policies in place to control the large group usage or all-day partying that impacts our neighbors when these groups rent the shelters. So I think it's an important line to draw to as one of the rules that's listed when they rent Prospect Park and they have 200 people. what it currently says, of course, is 3-2 beer only in cans. So I also agree it's, in those situations, allowing additional liquor or hard liquor could create issues that we're not used to having in our parks.
Mr. Pond and then Mr. Matthews.
So I just want to point out, I do want to thank Commissioner Namiach for coming down and sharing and I know that the Parks Commission will talk about this. I will say that from what I'm looking at, the description in the memorandum may be a little bit complicated as it kind of goes in and out of some different percentages and things like that. The ordinance, however, could not be more simple. It literally strikes out one portion of one line that only refers to the 3.2%, and that is concurrent with the state Senate bill that changes law on January 1st, 2019. So I think it's the most minimal and simple thing to do to be consistent with state law. We could talk a lot about whether people understand what malt or fermented malt is, et cetera, but since those are codified at the state level as state language, I think it makes sense, as our council has already suggested, that we just keep it the way it is. So I'm good with this the way it is.
Mr. Matthews.
Thank you, and I absolutely think it's absolutely imperative that we disallow liquors and other things to be in our parks, because it also gives the PD a very decent tool to be able to alleviate some behavior issues when they encounter them, where it might be a little more harder to enforce behavior from other issues, but if they're obviously drinking, the police can take care of that without having to make a big fuss. So it's imperative that we don't allow more liquor on the parks.
Thank you. Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess in reference to the special events that might occur and the consumption of alcohol either at that event or walking away from that event, is there any way to prevent someone from taking an alcohol beverage from a party hosted by some sort of special events permit in the park to another part of the park that isn't covered by that? And how would that be handled? Or
No, there's no provision. If they can drink it under the pavilion at their special event, or they can carry it across the road and watch a baseball game with it. We don't have a provision that I'm aware of. It's allowed in any spot in the park.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I wanted to circle back on one thing that Mr. Namiach had mentioned, and we specifically, this specifically allows fermented malt beverages, is that what I'm talking about, that are purchased. So if someone has given it to you, or if you've made it yourself, those would not be permitted in our parks.
So long as it has been purchased in a manner authorized. So, and there's plenty of other state law on that, and, using fake IDs and all that sort of thing. But yes, it says, what you wouldn't want, I assume, I'm trying to think of a fact pattern here, but there's someone that's 17, they're in the park. If you stopped with beer is okay in the park, then they would say, well, beer's okay in the park, I've got a beer. It was given to me by my Uncle Jerry, who's older than 17, and who bought it and gave it to me. Well, that wasn't purchased by me, the 17-year-old, in the manner authorized. Again, as the chief mentions, we've got, out of all the various calls, 7. I suspect that that's the fact pattern I can sort of invent to be responsive to your.
The only fact pattern that I kind of go back to is when I was a young boy, which was a few years before the 60s, my grandfather made what they called green beer. And, to smell it as a young child was not particularly pleasant, but apparently somebody enjoyed enjoyed consuming it, but does this prohibit home brew beer, fermented beer that you would make at home and bring to a park? Or am
Well, it hasn't been-
am I kind of getting into,
Respectfully, I think you are.
okay?
And maybe it does prohibit it because it hasn't been purchased in the manner authorized. That's the kind of beer that you can, says the code, that you can bring into the park. That's our current pattern anyhow, and as you can recognize, this ordinance doesn't alter that.
Would the fact pattern, if you had purchased the ingredients in an authorized manner?
Nope, because you're purchasing ingredients, you're not purchasing beer.
Okay.
So, I think probably if it ever came up, and someone was, drinking 5% beer that they had made at home, I'm not sure that they didn't purchase it in the manner authorized. If that becomes a problem,
Okay.
then perhaps it should be addressed, but I perceive that as being a vanishingly small number of.
Maybe we'll, as the chief gathers his data points in the future, if we have a problem with homebrew in the parks, we can come back and address it at that time.
We certainly can.
Thank you very much. Mr. Urban?
I think I may understand why that contains the word purchase, because if we're talking about a particular alcohol content, that is generally on that approved label, and therefore if it's purchased, it would have that label, versus a homebrew wouldn't have any label associated with it, and you wouldn't be able to tell the percentage possibly.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
I am going to vote for this because I think taking out the 3.2 is necessary for us to do before January 1st. So for that reason, I will vote for a consensus on this. However, I am still very confused by all this. For example, section 17-17 says, or will say, the consumption and/or storage of fermented malt beverages is permitted in any park or recreation area within the city so long as. So it is going to be permitted, or something else will be permitted. We don't know what will be permitted exactly. We can't really tell what it is that's being permitted.
I disagree. Fermented malt beverages is defined in state law. It's what the state's legislature has done is altered that definition to eliminate the Colorado's historic and long-held little distinction between 3.2 and 6% beer. That's all they've done, and so the state law definition of fermented malt beverages is really the same as it's always been, with the elimination of this, probably Colorado unique among many states, of having two grades. But that's knowing that it's a fermented malt beverage, there's a real clear definition of it. It's we're making the two kinds of beer in Colorado into one, and that's what the state legislature's done, and we're recognizing that in our local code.
Thank you. To continue, though, if you don't mind, I would like to put it on the record that I disagree with my colleague. I do not necessarily want to give the police department the ability to hassle people who are otherwise behaving nicely because of
That's uncalled for. This police department has never had a history of hassling people. I've provided you statistics out of 358 some calls for service. We've only had 7 related to alcohol. Tim, comment's totally inappropriate. If we had a history of hassling people, I'd be the first one to say we got to fix it.
Tim, what's your concern with that?
I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I don't mean to accuse you and or the police department, of which I'm very proud in that respect, the respect of honoring people's civil rights. My concern is that poor behavior is already against the law. We don't need a new law to make it against the law. So I just don't want to have a situation in which somebody who is behaving civilly may be drinking something that, I'm not a drinker, so I'm not really familiar with the way these cans look and the way they work. But I don't want to give police the authorization to question a person or to pressure a person.
This doesn't, Tim. This isn't on a new law. This is just an amendment to a current law. It doesn't give the police department any authority. It's just saying that beer is allowed in parks.
Yeah, and for that
That's
reason, and as I say, I'm going to vote for.
That's all it does. That's all this ordinance does.
I'm responding to
Okay.
what Larry said.
Okay, Mr. Matthews?
All I was trying to kind of lead around to is if someone appears to be inebriated in the park and there's a call to the police and the guy's got a liquor bottle or something like that, they're not out trying to measure anything or whatever. Liquor is definitely not allowed in the parks, and without having to make a big to-do, they have a way to immediately alleviate the problem without having to breathalyze or do anything. And what they have to do afterwards is fine, but it just gives them an opportunity that we know for sure that liquor is not allowed in the parks.
Well, I think this ordinance is really clear. The only thing it does is to bring our laws in the city of Wheat Ridge into conformance with state law with respect to 3-2 beer. Because in January, 3-2 beer is not going to be anymore. And this law, this change, I think is very succinct. And as Mr. Dahl said, it's about as minimalist as we could make it happen. Is there any more discussion on this issue? Mr. Pond?
I'd ask for a consensus to move this ordinance forward to.
Do we have consensus on that? Okay, we have consensus on that. Ms. Manwaring, Chief, and Mr. Dahl, thank you very much for bringing this forward. Okay, we are going to go to
Electric bikes.
item number 3, electrical assisted bikes. Do we have a
We
presentation?
Do.
Are you?
I think
this
probably
is
the same group.
Is this the trifecta? Okay. Please proceed.
All right, back in May, I brought an ordinance forward amending our park rules and regulations to allow electrical bikes on the trail. So currently, our code reads that no non-motorized vehicles, and not that an electric bike is motorized, but it's in between riding a motorcycle down the trail and pedaling on your own accord. So these bikes are, of course, you're probably aware, getting popular. They really allow people to get out more, ride our trails. We don't have mountain bike trails, which is a conflict in other communities as to whether allow them on mountain biking trails or soft surface trails. So this ordinance brings forward allowing electrical bikes. And to refresh your memory, it allowed all electrical bikes. We've gone back and done additional due diligence, so we're only allowing class 1 and 2 electrical bikes, which cannot exceed a 20 mile per hour speed limit. And of course, when you are on the trail riding a bike, you must abide by the speed limit, which is posted at 15. A class 3 bike has a throttle and allows people to ride it get to a faster speed in a quicker manner, I believe, and they go over 20 miles an hour. So we are not allowing those, just class 1 and 2. So that's a new ordinance this evening to allow that legally on our trail.
Mr. Matthews?
Refresh my memory, and I can't remember if this was before I was elected or shortly thereafter, but I remember having or hearing at least discussions about electric bikes on our bike paths, and I thought we handled that once before. What am I missing here?
I believe it was in May when we brought a broader ordinance, and we had some public input from some bike stakeholder groups, and they suggested that we go back and define bicycle more clearly. And so that's what I'm bringing back to you tonight. I've done that. And we're defining bicycle as electric bikes as class 1 or 2. So no action, to my knowledge, was taken on it in May, other than it would come back amended to better define bicycle.
Mr. Ann?
Can you just remind me the difference between class 1 and 2?
The difference between class 1 and 2 is a class 2 bicycle will, I believe, in layman's terms, the battery is bigger, and so it'll take you to that speed more quickly than a class 1. But both 1s and 2 are pedal assisted. You have to pedal them to get to those speeds. They just help you along, one at a little quicker rate.
Okay, and it's not something that's always, it's not always, the motor isn't always going, from my understanding. It's just kind of used to help you with your climbing up.
Yes,
Right.
as you're pedaling.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Questions or additional comments from staff, from council? Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as it relates to the overall trail system and the markings and the signage along the greenbelt, for instance, do we have any plans to upgrade that, putting in a center median or other signage along there that would either sort of help navigate these various types of, not these in particular, but as we see increased usage along the greenbelt, is there any plans to provide some increased amenities for the trail?
So unrelated to electric bikes?
Unrelated to electric bikes, but just the general sense of having either a center line along the trail, having signage along the trail relative to some sort of speed limits, those kinds of things.
Well, we do have speed limits posted. We don't have an amenity such as a mile marker because it's difficult to decide where to start that mile marker. So we try to provide information in the kiosks at specific trailheads like 41st and Youngfield. I believe there are some lines painted to divide the trail where it either curves or it has an especially, it's more difficult to navigate through there, but it's not, we don't consistently draw that line or paint that line down the middle.
Thank you.
Thank you. Was there, is there something special about 14 inches in diameter? I noticed that the definition of bicycle has the wheels, all of which are more than 14 inches in diameter, and does that differentiate, say, a child's bicycle or something like that from an adult, or?
That's a good question, Mayor. I believe it's so we don't get large three-wheeled, fat-tired vehicles.
Well, I mean, it just says that bicycles have tires that are larger than 14 inches in diameter. So if you're riding one that's less than that, it's not a bicycle. And
I'm sorry, I do not have an answer for
Okay.
that question. I don't know, Jerry, do you recall how bicycle is defined? Or we got to that conclusion? Okay.
And then also it sounds like that a bicycle built for two would not, maybe that is okay, 2 tandem wheels. I guess a bicycle built for two would qualify.
Do you have a tandem bike?
No, but I didn't get enough riding in this summer, so hopefully this will incentivize me next year to.
Pardon? Well, my staff says perhaps to differentiate between toys and bicycles, adult bicycles.
We can see if we can find some information before it comes back
Okay,
on first reading to see if
I don't know.
there is a distinction of what that really
It seems
means.
like we were, it was reasonably specific that it had to be more than 14 inches in diameter, and I didn't know if that would lead us down a rabbit hole that we didn't want to go down. Any more discussion on the electrical bicycle ordinance? Do I have consensus on council to move this forward? Okay, we have consensus to move this forward. Once again, thank you for your report. That's all the papers with writing on them. So we will go to our staff reports. Mr. Goff.
Yeah, just a couple items. I believe you've all should have received some emails from Colorado Municipal League about the Amendment 74. Does that sound familiar? They sent some packets out. They're encouraging and urging us to take a position on it. Amendment 74 would amend the Colorado Constitution to require just compensation if private property has, quote, reduced fair market value by government law or regulation, end quote. And that's basically all is how it's defined. CML believes that potentially any municipal action or inaction could result in a change in fair market value of a property, which could potentially trigger many lawsuits against the city. So I'm not sure how much you've read about this amendment, but CML is encouraging that City Council takes a stand and passes a resolution in opposition of this. If you want more information, we can discuss that tonight, or if you know enough about it, and if you are favorable, we could bring back a resolution on Monday for opposition. And I don't know if Mr. Dahl has any comments on Amendment 74, how much he's brushed up on all the amendments, but maybe between the two of us, we can help answer any questions that you may have.
The best example I can think of from a land use standpoint is the city, and the city does this all the time, amends the land use code, the schedule of uses permitted in the C1 zone district, just making it up, and decides that they want to eliminate a use. And because it's antiquated, or they just want to eliminate a use, they feel it's no longer appropriate in that zone district, despite the fact that there may be no properties in that zone district that are engaged in that use. That takes away a potential use if I'm a property owner in that zone district, and I have potentially decreased the value that my property has potentially been decreased because I don't have the ability to undertake that use. More pertinent to the city, and quite a few years ago now, the city defined psychic advisors and body art establishments and made them special use permit uses in a given zone district. And while they're still allowed, you need a special use permit, and that means there's more process. Those are two examples of things that potentially affect the fair market value of property. Colorado has a constitutional provision that mirrors and is more stringent than the federal constitution. It says private property may not be taken for public use. Colorado Constitution, I think, says taken or damaged for public use without just compensation. And of course, that's the statute or the constitutional provision under which you have to condemn property. If you want to extend a roadway and you want private property, you condemn it, and you offer money, and if you can't agree, then you condemn. So there's already a takings provision that's very standard in the U.S. Constitution and state constitutions, but this language is added then to that provision, injecting sort of this fair market value for a regulatory change. And the kinds of regulatory changes are immense in terms of the fact patterns you can think up. It's pretty much anything we would do to Chapter 26 that potentially could affect my ability to apply for a new use or use it for a different use, or those are the examples I can think of to make it a little more real.
Another example CML listed was if the city decided to allow short-term rentals, Airbnb.
Yep.
Property owners could say that has a negative impact on their property values because there's an Airbnb next door, there's additional traffic and noise. They could file suit against the city saying you decreased the value of my property, so I'm going to sue you. That was another example they gave. I think Jerry mentioned body art establishments. The city, if we regulate adult entertainment establishments, they can only be in certain areas of our community, which we totally have the right to do. An adult entertainment establishment could sue the city, say you've decreased my right to fair market value of my property to have an adult entertainment establishment. So it opens up a can of worms that people could sue for almost any action or inaction that the city takes. I think pretty much every other city, as far as I've heard so far, are passing some type of resolution to oppose this. This has been brought forward by, I've been told, the oil and gas industry to deal with some issues that they've been dealing with. So it's an out-of-state issue that is been brought forward to amend the Colorado Constitution.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
I was just going to highlight that this is a constitutional amendment, so once it's there, it's almost impossible to change it, perfect it. We will live with it forever if it's passed.
Ms. Duran?
I'd like to see us entertain a resolution opposing this
Opposition?
for me. Yep.
Is there a consensus on that? There's consensus on that. Would you please get that drafted so we could look at it next week?
Yep, we'll bring that forward on Monday. CML has a draft ordinance weekend or a resolution. Just real quickly too, most of you responded, but we do have a joint meeting with the school district on October 10th, at 12 noon at Stevens Elementary. I think everybody in this room I've heard from except Tim and Zach. If you would let me know if you could, you'll be there. Okay. Tim, do you know if you can attend or? I don't know. Okay. Zach, you said yes. Okay. Haven't heard from Janice and George. You were a maybe. Do you know if you're a yes or no yet? Yeah, I'm still maybe. Okay. I'm going to be there, but might have to leave. Yeah. Okay. Okay. School district just needs to know so they can order lunch.
Okay.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Item number 5, elected officials reports. Do any of our elected officials have a report they'd like to make? Mr. Matthews.
Thank you. I have just two related items here. I just, within the last day or so, received the tentative agenda schedule. And one of those items, for instance, is Bulk Plain is now on the tentative schedule for October 15th. And I know there are a lot of citizens have been waiting with bated breath to hear about when that's going to happen. And I think it would be most helpful for everybody, but for the citizens that are watching our issues, if all of our tentative schedules are posted on either somewhere on the calendar page or on the council page, somewhere where it's conspicuous, but understand maybe you don't want to change the council page every 2 or 3 months, and so what have you. But Ms. Archer reminded me here that that's been something she's been waiting to hear about forever, and I don't think it's fair for citizens to find out about it on Thursday night before the Monday, that all of a sudden now that's when that topic is going to come up. And I know we're short-staffed tonight, so I wanted to bring it up. I would probably be making a motion to that at some time in the future, but I would like to see our tentative schedules listed somewhere where the general populace can find them.
The only concern I have with that is this is really more of an internal document for our planning purposes. The tentative agenda changes a lot. I'd hate for citizens to come to a meeting when something gets moved at the last minute. Maybe we could look at posting the next 2 or 3 meetings out or something, because those are maybe a more closer to being more formalized, but because there's on here, there's 4 months out.
Willing to discuss that, but
we can look
I
at
would
that.
like to see something other than the 3-day notice, 3 or 4 day notice. I mean, our tentative schedule, even for us, had run out, so I had no idea, past August, what was coming up soon, because we didn't get a tentative schedule out even to us. So anyway, just FYI for everybody, the 15th is Bulk Plain tentatively, but I think we should be posting some kind of notice out more than 3 days of items that are coming up at our meetings.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's set in stone.
The bulk plane.
Yeah, the 15th.
It's tentative.
Okay. Mr. Urban.
Just to remind everybody, though, that was a Hoppy Pond item, and it's very limited in scope, what they had talked about. So just to keep that in mind, right?
Mr. Ann?
Can you explain what you mean by limited in scope? Just to make it clear for Dorothy and whoever else is listening.
Well, the item is to discuss the bulk plan as it had already been discussed and presented at the last iteration, and applying that to the city. That's it. I mean, so that's what I agreed to, not to talk about heights and or different spring points or different configurations of the bulk plane, but taking the bulk plane that we have already enacted in an R1C zoning and discussing applying that bulk plane across the city. That is it.
Well, that's what I wanted to clarify, because a lot of citizens wanted to discuss the height, and were under the impression that this discussion was going to include that. So if that's not, and it's limited to just bulk plane across the city, I want that made clear to them, because, I mean, we should be able to talk about anything at any time, anywhere, but...
Absolutely. Then I will withdraw my support of it moving forward. So my point is that I completely support us, as I did when this issue came up, of applying this across the city. What I've consistently said is that some of these other issues, which are very important to talk about, those were also wrapped up in the larger discussions like the NRS and essentially these larger zoning conversations. And so what I've always been reticent to do and not wanting to do is start picking these things up one by one and start to do it without looking holistically at it. Now, the only reason that I'm willing to pick up the bulk plane one in this limited scope is because we have talked about this. We did talk about it. We actually, if people would go back to the video records and the archives of the time that we talked about it, it was actually recommended at that point or discussed from staff that this would be something that could be easily applied to the entire city. And at that point, I actually agreed with that, and so when Janice approached me to put this on, I said I support that at this scope. So I'm being consistent because I have not supported drifting until we get back further information, broader information that provides a holistic view of other things. And if that's not what people want to do, then I think we should take it off the agenda.
No,
Mr. Ann?
I understand what you're saying. I just want it to be clear that that discussion is only about bulk plane through the city, because a lot of citizens are thinking this is a discussion on the original discussion from 2016 was regarding height limitations in that particular zoning area in East Wheat Ridge. So I don't want people coming in being disappointed, frustrated, because we're not talking about that.
I get that completely, and I thought it was written pretty clearly, but if we think that it's not, if we think it's written in such a way to imply that there's a bigger discussion, then I very carefully made that pretty clear on my side. And so and Patrick, I don't know if you feel like somehow it's not written clearly. I thought it was.
Well, yeah, on the tentative agenda, it's pretty clear, I believe. It says bulk plane regulations in all residential districts. I mean, that's a simple title.
Yes,
of
but
course,
I think
memo will be
the memo,
clearer.
The intention that I had made was that the memo should be clear, to your point, clear about what the framework of that discussion is, and what I just said is what I intended to support with Janice.
Let me go to Mr. Fitzgerald.
I was just going to say by virtue of elucidation here, the general topic of bulk plane was part of something that was part of a basket of interrelated issues that are related to the NRS. And the NRS neighborhood meetings are going on right now. So at a certain point, we'll be ready to discuss not only this issue, but a number of other issues that are all difficult issues, but are all interrelated to the city as a whole and the neighborhood and how we see our future.
Mr. Ann?
So then my point is, if we are relying on the NRS to have meetings, outreach, and bring this all back to us regarding height, regarding bulk plane, then why are we not letting them just do their job? Why are we even having the discussion regarding bulk plane citywide when we're relying on them to bring this to us?
Mr. Bond?
I completely agree, which is why I would say I would recommend us pulling this item. But I'm going to go back to what I said. I hate to repeat myself, but we actually had a pretty good discussion, had a very complete staff report, came to a strong consensus, almost went as far in that meeting as to applying it to the whole city. I would have, and I indicated as so much in the meeting, that I was okay with that. So I'm just saying that if that helps advance this topic for some constituents who have been asking for it, in advance of what I agree with you, and I agreed with Tim about essentially allowing the work to happen. I feel like, in fact, this work was essentially done and can stand apart because it was essentially already, worked out, and I don't think that it actually interferes with some of these other things. In my mind, I was willing to do it then. I'm willing to do it today, tomorrow, whenever, and to talk about it and to do it. And I don't think it impedes the holistic approach that I'm talking about or what you guys are talking about. If you think it's going to be confusing, if you think it's going to cause some problem, I am completely fine with pausing on it and waiting for it, because I 100% agree with what Mr. Fitzgerald said and what your concerns are. So I will withdraw my support for it if that's what you want.
Mr. Ann?
I wasn't there, the meeting that you had with some constituents. Okay. I think Councilor Matthews was there. My only concern, like I said, is just I don't want anyone thinking that this is a broader discussion and to be misled. That's all I'm saying. And if we're going to rely on the NRS to kind of bring us back all this information, citizen input, everything over the next year, that I support. I just don't want anybody feeling frustrated or let down when they come in here 15th or whenever thinking, oh, we're just talking about bulk plane. That's my only concern, but I wasn't part of Janice's motion for this.
Yeah,
You two were, so.
I mean, I want to say that you and I are in complete agreement, because I'm really worried about it. I was worried about it. That's why I was pretty insistent, with Janice. It's like, listen, I'm okay with this, but I'm very concerned about it, going beyond that. And if, to your point, if people might be confused by that or expect that or be dissatisfied with that, then I'm not okay with it either. And frankly, since you're probably closer to it in some ways, to the origin of some of these things, I would in some ways rely on your judgment right now as to, or in the next few days as to whether or not you think this will help or hurt. Because I just want you to know, I absolutely agree with you. I have the exact same fears for the exact same reasons. I do not want it coming forward and becoming a topic that we can't actually get to without the other work happening. So if you think that we can, that this could become confusing or not be beneficial, then I don't think we should do it.
Can I take a couple days of outreach just to clarify that, and then I can let you know? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Very good. Mr. Urban, do you have a report?
Thank you, sir. I guess this would have been better discussed under the electrical assisted bicycle ordinance, but as it relates to those bicycles, has there been any thought given to disallowing either the abandonment or placement of those bicycles by companies or other individuals renting them, or
These are different than the scooters, but Mr. Goff, have you?
Yeah, I mean, there's the scooters, there's the what do you call them, Uber bikes? Or yeah, docked or undocked bikes, right, that Mr. Urban's speaking about. And we haven't seen that issue yet. I think that will have to be a policy discussion with you guys, that if that does become an issue. We haven't had any companies dump them in Wheat Ridge, fortunately. Not saying that it won't happen. I know Denver is cracking down on it pretty hard right now, so.
I guess just to at least consider the possibility of getting ahead of that situation and disallowing bikes to be either dumped or placed along the greenbelt, especially if not all of our parks. I'm okay with them being in docked areas, but being dockless and dropped in public parks is concerning to me.
Well,
That's
I
all the
think,
report I have.
The little scooters are not, their wheels are not 14 inches or greater in diameter, so they're not allowed.
At least on the trails, but yeah.
Okay. Additional reports, Ms. Duran?
Not a report, but a question.
Okay.
The NRS meetings that are taking place, are those posted on our website? Or how's the public outreach for those?
The outreach is being done by the steering committee members themselves. They're inviting folks to those meetings. They're not, they've been instructed to reach out and try to. Mr. Matthews can maybe speak to it. His wife's on the committee, but they're to reach out and invite people to their group meetings, and they're holding I think 3 apiece. So we're not advertising those on the website because they're invited.
Okay, I'm just wondering how is that process? Do you know of inviting?
Yeah, the steering committee members and invite those folks.
Yeah, the members themselves have been tasked to do an outreach in any way they wish.
Okay, that's what I
So it's
wondered.
broken up into a lot of small groups. My wife, and I'm not sure how she did it, because I've kind of been trying to stay a little bit separate from that, let it process work out, but rented some a meeting place and then had like 10 people come down or whatever. I don't even know about the number of people, but invited whatever they had agreed as a group should be. I don't think it was limited to just 10. If 12 people wanted to come, they could all come, but each one of the members
does
was
the outreach.
to do the outreach, and they had broken it up by districts of the city to try and get representative areas attending.
And that's for this
Okay,
phase.
thank you.
There'll be public announcements and notices that we'll get out through our social media for the public town hall type meetings that we have. And then if you remember, we have a joint meeting with City Council and Planning Commission coming up in November too, so that will be posted, so. Yep.
Additional elected officials reports? I have nothing. Is there any further business to come before our study session? Then we will stand adjourned. Thank you very much.